Welcome to M&A Diaries. On this episode, I sit down with Jonathon Dickens, Managing Partner of SMH Group. We take a deep dive into the M&A process, covering each particular stage in detail. Jonathon is a seasoned acquirer and was able to provide some amazing insights, as well as providing hints and tips for those that are potentially looking at selling or acquiring in the future. Hi, Jonathon. Thanks for being with us today. I wanted to get you on this podcast for various reasons, but obviously you've been acquiring quite a bit over in recent years. And this particular episode, I really wanted us to go step by step through the process leading up to a transaction in the M&A space. I think a lot of people know the kind of ins and outs and what comes with it, but actually the step-by-step process, I get it quite a lot when I'm putting two parties together where what's next, James? What is the next step? So I'd like to get into that and dissect each particular stage. But before I do so, it'd be great if you wouldn't mind giving a bit of background on yourself and obviously SMH as well.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me on here. So I've been with SMH Group since 2005. I was at a place for 1 year before that, but I basically joined as an apprentice in 2005. Been there for just over 19 years now. Every position, I guess, up through the ranks. I was doing my AAT, then on to ACA, apprentice, junior, semi-senior, senior, manager, all that. I became a partner in 2014 when I was 26. And now my title in theory is group partner. Unofficially, I'm kind of head of acquisitions as well. SMH Group has only been called SMH Group for a couple of years, actually. Back in the day, it was Sutton McGrath Limited, then Sutton McGrath Hartley. But we decided with our business model of taking on new practices around the region that having sort of a group title worked quite well. So in 2017, the sort of founder of the business, David Sutton, he retired. James Hartley, my business partner, and I did a management buyout. And James and I now own SMH Holdings, which is the sort of holding company of SMH Group. So that's kind of a quick 5 minutes on where we are now.
No, I appreciate it. And I think, how many acquisitions have you done in that time since you've kind of been leading the charge?
I was counting up this morning because there's a constant pipeline and there's always a deal going on, but we've actually done and finalised 10 deals to date, and that's since 2017. Yeah. So we're averaging just over one a year, maybe sometimes two a year.
Yeah, and that's some growth from some acquisition, and that's why it'll be great to kind of get your insights and the good, the bad, and the ugly that you've seen at different stages as well during the process.
Yeah, sure. So, I very often say that if we was to do the first deal that we did back in 2018, early 2018, if I was to do that deal again today, I think it'll look a lot different. You know, you learn as you go along, and you learn the sort of ways of doing things, and what we thought was normal then perhaps isn't so normal in terms of how deals look nowadays. But you learn from everyone, and I think that our pipeline is getting stronger as well. We're due to complete in the next sort of 3 to 4 weeks on another practice. We've got heads of terms agreed at another, and just a constant flow of opportunity, really. So it's a great time in the M&A market.
Oh, absolutely. There's lots of activity. But no, we'll come on to some of your learnings later on, actually. But why don't we kick off right at the very, very beginning of the process? And obviously that usually is the introductory meeting between you and the vendor. So at these kind of meetings, I always say it's more of a meet and greet, get to learn a little bit more about each other first and foremost, because you're going to be working with each other going forward, but that real headline information on the business as well, on the practice. So what are you looking for when you're sitting down with someone for the first time? I'm trying
to get them to like me, I suppose. Whilst it's me sort of finding out a bit about them, I'd like them to see that, I'm just a normal guy. We're just a normal firm, trying to sort of, progress the business and grow the business. But ultimately, we're not cowboys. We're not people that's going to promise this and then not come through with it. We're just good, honest people. Our moral compass points in the right direction, all these kind of things. And I think what's important for me is a couple of brokers sometimes will try and instigate this initial meeting, and they'll say, can you do a Teams call, or, can you perhaps have an initial conversation with them over the phone? And I'll always say, no, my first meeting with the seller has to be in person.
Yeah.
Those first impressions are really important. And I think it's, we talk about seeing the whites of people's eyes, and I think it works both ways for buyer and seller to have that chat. And don't get me wrong, some sellers are quite coy when it comes to what they're willing to share in that first meeting. I've been to some meetings who don't even tell me what they turn over. They just literally want to talk generally. So I think it's very important to have that initial chat in person and see if you've got some sort of rapport between us both.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And obviously where you're making your acquisitions, it's all kind of in a good area and close proximity to yourself. Obviously there's others out there who are acquiring way outside of their own area where they're based. So sometimes, unfortunately, it has to be virtual, but I agree with you. Whites of eyes, you just really, you can't get a good feel for someone unless you meet them in person. And often, a lot of times, actually, the vendors feel that they're not too sure what they should be providing or speaking about, especially if a conversation going well, it's flowing, and then you start getting into a bit more detail. I've certainly been party to some of those meetings, and the vendor will just take a little look to the left of me and look, it's fine. You're feeling comfortable. This is probably good to carry on this conversation at this age.
Yeah, I think accountants generally, or I think it's changing, but the sort of the generation that's selling up now in the accountancy space are very private people. There's a lot of firms out there that trade as partnerships so that people can't find information out about them, even though the tax burden will be worse on them. They prefer the privacy over the tax savings. And I think sometimes in those kind of conversations, I've been in initial meetings before when I've sort of said, do you rent your building or do you own it? And they're like, we're not willing to share that information. And it's like, I could find out, Land Registry would tell me this, but, some people are just very, very cautious on what they're willing to share. And does that make it harder? Does that drag out the process? I guess it probably does, but equally it means when they are sharing information with you've already sort of broke down that trust barrier in terms of, okay, if they're willing to share it now, then that first meeting must have gone well and they must think we're okay to deal with. So you can sort of take some positives from it as well.
No, absolutely. And obviously before we kind of move on to that initial sharing of information stage, that both sides have been happy with the first meeting, and then you start looking at some further non-financial and financial information. I think it's important also to say that often it's not just the one meeting. This may be 2 or 3 meetings where you're getting together, and as you said, building up that trust, building up that rapport, and really feeling comfortable with each other.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and a very current case we've got going on now. I met with a practice probably 5 or 6 weeks ago before the holiday season started. We had a decent initial chat. It was quite basic, high-level stuff. This particular firm were quite cautious on sharing information. We all went on our holidays, and then when we got back, we met up last week and just had a second informal chat at the same place, just a cup of tea, cup of coffee, and they were willing to sort of give a bit more information that time. I think what's also important from a buyer side is, and something that I've learned over the deals that we've done, get your non-negotiable on the table from the start. As a buyer, there's no point having these meetings, sharing information, then sort of saying, oh, by the way, this is how we do a deal, and straight away it's a non-starter for them or a non-starter for us. I think there's a couple of things that typically the way we deal or we put a structure together is kind of set in stone. So I like to get that out there as well. People are busy, time's money. We don't want to be wasting people's time, so we just get it out there early doors.
Yeah, super important. Super important that. Yeah, finding out what the key motivations are for both sides early on, and establishing if there is a conversation there and negotiations that can take place, or as you said, this is red line. We're not going to be able to move past that. And if that's a deal breaker for you, then I wish you well. We're all busy.
Yeah, and I think one thing I will say, and I'm conscious I don't want to give too many trade secrets away on this podcast, but I think some advice that you could give to sellers that you were representing is, just sometimes you have to think about what you're saying and how it can impact a deal. Things such as, it's not about the money for us, or things such as, I've got plenty of cash in the bank already. And these kind of things, I'm jotting them down mentally in my head thinking, okay, right, so it's not about the money. You don't need much cash up front. Okay, and anything else you want to tell me,
Yeah.
So, that's kind of a bit of advice that hopefully not many people listen to, because it makes life easier as a buyer.
No, it's finding that balance, isn't it, between opening up and giving that support to then, as we all know, business is business, and sometimes there's certain negotiables that will take place and not giving everything away at the very start. But no, you're right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've had the first initial meeting with the vendor or the selling party. Both parties have come away feeling pretty happy. Next steps usually is, sharing information, both financially and non-financially. So from your perspective, what are you looking for at this point? What are the headline pieces of information that you'd expect to see and want to see?
Well, ideally, and it seems obvious, but the reality is that the last few years' accounts plus some up-to-date management accounts is a good start. I think, again, what you'll find with more traditional practices that will be coming to market in the near future, they don't do management accounts. They don't need their information for themselves. Businesses been doing the same thing for years and years. They don't get any useful information as they see it from it, so they don't do management accounts. So, we could be looking at accounts from 20 months ago in some cases, which is obviously already out of date. But ideally, last few years' accounts, up-to-date management accounts, some sort of redacted staff information. Part of what we look for now when we're buying practices is good members of staff. Have they got any skill sets in areas where we might be lacking or looking to recruit? That kind of stuff. From that, I'll just bombard them with questions. And I guess one thing to just mention at this point is if it's a broker-led deal and it's the kind of brokers who just sort of give an intro and leave you to it, I'll just sort of at this stage ask them to maybe step aside and allow me to contact the seller direct and just start that communication process instead of filtering everything through a broker who's not actively involved in the sort of early stages of DD, but just become a bit of a gatekeeper, and that can sort of hinder things and slow things down a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, we've obviously discussed that off camera and, involvement and different brokers out there and how they operate and become involved. And that we are heavily involved in those transactions throughout, which, has, and I think it's important, again, balance is everything here, right? It's knowing your place and not getting in the way of good conversation and progression and letting that rapport be built, but also involved enough to pick up the pieces if there's bits that may well fall between two pillar and post, which often can happen, as well as just act as that buffer sometimes to really be able to have those heart-to-heart conversations that need to happen when it's principal to principal, there's a little bit of posturing going on potentially as well, which goes back to the point we was making earlier on. I guess this initial information sharing stage for me, I don't know in your experience, because of all the reasons you just mentioned, is always when things slow down at this point because they haven't got the financials together, the management accounts together they needed. They probably haven't got their staff schedule. Some people may well ask for a client breakdown schedule as well, anonymized, of course. But all of these reports, they don't have to hand. So for me, this is where I always say to clients who are looking at a sale or a merger is get prepared with all of this kind of information beforehand, because it's going to be smoother for you, but also all you're going to do is add frustrations to the acquiring party that you're speaking to as well, because momentum is key with these conversations.
That's right, yeah. And sometimes some of the information that we ask for, they don't have it readily available, but it's useful stuff for their business. And, I sometimes say to them, if this comes to nothing, if you choose not to sell to us or you choose not to sell at all, keep maintaining this data. It's useful data for your business. You can only benefit from reviewing this information on a regular basis.
Yeah.
It's important info.
I actually had that with a deal that completed earlier this year, where last year they went for a transaction. Unfortunately, it fell through at the last minute, but because they'd gone through, and we'll come on to that later on, a full DD sweep, it actually helped tidy up their business ready for sale this year, which worked out really well for the vendor in the end. So, prime example there.
Definitely.
You should be doing this anyway, but actually once you're forced to do it, it's for the best of the business, regardless of you successfully transacting or not.
Correct, yeah. And, ultimately, when we're looking at things and I'm asking these questions of the finances, what I'm trying to establish is, what does this business really look like for us going forward? What are we acquiring here? We know what the turnover is, ballpark. We know what the staff costs are. Let's look at what synergies we can make and let's see how we can improve it. And what I'm trying to establish from asking these questions is, what is the forecasted EBITDA going to look like if we buy this business? So if the amount of data that they can provide isn't strong enough for me to be able to do that, to get a forecasted EBITDA kind of number, we can't really move things on. So if they don't have that information, they've got to go and find it. If they're not willing to put in the work to provide the information, we can't go beyond that. Ultimately, we need to get that information to make an informed decision on whether it's worth moving things forward for us.
Yeah.
And, without giving too much away about our model, if the business is below a certain size, we would look to sort of merge it with one of our other offices. If it's over a certain size, we'd look to maintain their site and create sort of a new hub. But they're the other things I'm looking at throughout this process. If we merge sites, what does the new entity look like? Do we have the capacity in that site? What about contracts that we're stuck with? Are we in a 10-year lease, for example? Is merging going to be a non-starter? And that's the kind of the facts I'm trying to ascertain through this initial set of questions.
Yeah, just specifically looking at the commerciality of the deal as a whole at this stage, without really lifting up the bonnet too much, which comes later on. So you've received this information. There's probably been a back and forth as well, where you're looking for clarity on certain pieces that have been sent over, or the information has just led to more questions, as often is the case as well. But you've got to a place where you're comfortable, you feel like you've got a good grasp on the business, and let's say this particular opportunity is one that you do wish to explore further and would like to take forward. So that usually leads to an indicative offer or proposal at this stage for the vendor to look at, see if they want to commit some more time. People often ask me, is this a legally binding letter? Is this something I need to sign in right now? For me, I always say, no, it's not legally binding. This is just a case making sure that you're both on the same path, both thinking the way, and then commit to, a head term stage where there is obviously one legally binding clause as such, which is exclusivity. So you're not wasting each other's time, both from a cost perspective, but a time cost perspective. But just to rewind slightly on that proposal, obviously that's going to be you putting your first foot forward. Do you often see a negotiation point, or in your experience, have you tended to read the room well, so to speak, from the conversations and the information?
Yeah, I think it's important that when that initial offer goes over, and we do it all via email, nice to keep a trail of it all. I think when that first offer goes over, it's important that there's no shocks in there. I think along the way I mentioned the non-negotiables. In those initial meetings, we've talked rough deposits, we've talked rough payment terms, we've talked rough multiples. So these kind of things, we've sowed the seed so that when that first offer comes along, there's no shocks. And again, I think that's important. You don't want to be upsetting people from the off. So we send across an offer, and it's not about hitting them with a low offer or anything early doors. Ideally, they come back to that first one and say, great, it's an offer at a position that we think's fair and a true representation of the market. So we put that offer out. There's a clear structure in our offer in terms of a breakdown of how we want to do it, what a deal looks like for them, timings, the outgoing sellers, what their position looks like, or some consulting, or some staying as employees, directors, salary levels, all that kind of stuff is structured in this offer. And then there is a bit of back and forth. Sometimes it's asking for clarity around certain areas. Sometimes they might want to know something that wasn't in this initial offer. And I think sometimes as well, in my notes here, I've put, beware of the man down the pub. So sometimes a seller will speak to people they know in business and say, this is kind of what we've been offered. What do you think? And then all of a sudden they come back and try and negotiate a point that they previously thought was fair, that now somebody else has told them, oh, you should ask for this, or you should ask for that. And all of a sudden it opens it up again. So, but it's nice to get to a point, and I'll always say, can I get your confirmation that you now accept this as it is? And then, before we move to legals. So it's important to get like an end point on negotiations to say, right, we're both in agreement with this now before we move on to the next stage.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think you're right. That sometimes you do get those circumstances where at that point they do go off speaking to their peers or people in the network they know to get their opinion. But more so, I find at this stage, because you kind of worked out what valuation people are putting on the business, what they're looking for. It's small minor tweaks around. It could be a consultancy arrangement. Okay, so you've put me 3 days a week here. I want to come down to 2 days a week within 6 months. That kind of conversation. And then a lot of the time, they're now then thinking about what the differences will be on day one. So then they'll start, rather than the actual deal itself, it's more just understanding, okay, what are you going to start doing with my clients and my staff on day one? And you start having that conversation with moving to head to term.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of a unique selling point of us as a practice of the SMH group. So when we have the discussions with sellers, we very often use the concept of, look, 90% will stay the same and 10% will change over time. We keep their brand, we keep their staff, we keep their officers if appropriate, we keep the style, we keep the ethos of that practice. Very often the businesses we buy are well more established in terms of how long they've been going than we are. A recent practice that we bought in Huddersfield has been going since 1903, and there's a picture of the founder in the meeting room. We're not going to come in and take that down and rebrand, and we aren't that kind of practice. And I think getting that information across to sellers just gives them comfort. You've got a lot of people here in accountancy who've probably been at that firm for 40 years plus, and some of the staff that they've worked with have been there for just the same amount of time. The key thing for them, we say it's not about money in some cases. Of course, there's an element of it being about money, but they want to make sure the staff are safe and the clients are happy. We can give those assurances, which means we can move on to the next phase, perhaps a lot faster than some other acquirers who do go for the rebranding and the overhauls of systems straight away.
And again, one thing that's just coming to mind as we're talking there, and I'm guessing you'll be in the same position where you've had acquisitions over the years. You have people that have gone through the process, you gone out the other side, and usually at this stage before heads of terms are signed, I would see people asking to speak with people like that in that camp where you've acquired, so they can get all stories of how the process was and what's been like working with you afterwards.
Yeah, just a few points on that. Firstly, the last two practices we bought, so two practices that we bought in 2024, both came to us via previous sellers. So they contacted us and said, we've spoke to so-and-so who you bought this business off. They said we should reach out to you guys if we're looking at an exit. And that kind of introduction is just fantastic.
Strong recommendation. You can't beat that.
Us, Exactly. And we also, you mentioned about speaking to previous sellers. What we say is, if we're in discussions with a firm, we'll give you the phone numbers of everybody we've bought a business off before who's available. And we won't even tell them that you're ringing. Ring them, email them, do whatever you want, because we're confident that everybody who bought a business off previously will have nothing negative to say about us. That's how confident we are.
Yeah. For me, I think that there is one of the most powerful tools that you could wheel out, regardless of, what you can say about the business and the rapport that you build up. If you can get them in front of someone that's gone through that, and I just think that's one of the most powerful tools out there. And it's great that you've got those examples to wheel out each and every time now. And obviously that pool of people will only get larger as you acquire. So we've got the agreement, verbal agreement. Heads of terms are then drafted, which is basically just documenting the agreement in a little bit more of a legal way, if you like. Obviously, within this, there's no legal requirements apart from usually the exclusivity clause, and that's just saying, look, we're going to have a backstop of 3 to 6 months here, and you will not be talking to anyone else. A lot of people always ask me this question with heads of terms. Do you use a lawyer to draft up the heads of terms, or have you got your set pro forma now that you just wheel out and send over to the vendors? And each vendors always ask me, do they need to get a lawyer to look over the HOTS?
So the way we do it, the way we structure our offer is set out in almost a heads of terms structure. So when we've agreed on, and this email chain's had some back and forth to us, when I send this email to say, are we now in agreement, to me, that is our heads of terms. So when we then instruct solicitors, that email chain and that structured sort of offer and layout of everything, that is our heads of terms. So the solicitors that we use know what they're going to get from us when we say we've got a new deal, and they use that as the basis to form the SPA or the APA.
Yeah. I know others as well that, use a documentation slide as such, which again is just their indicative offer, but actually once it's signed, they just use that as a head of terms because it's the way it's laid out. So yeah, some people deal with it in the way that you've just described, and then others do go down the more formal route. But I think the most important part of this stage is that you are all in alignment and agreement, and it's that handshake of, we're not speaking to anyone else now. There's no other dating going on. We're just speaking to each other, and we're all eyes on getting this deal done between us. I think that's the key element here on the heads of term stage.
Yeah, and I think listen, all sellers are different, but I've had it before where we've had a chat around a deal structure. We've got sort of the key parts of a deal structure verbally. We've then put it in an email, a bit of back and forth on an email, and I've sort of said, are you in agreement with this? And one of the chaps replied and said, as far as I'm concerned, when we shook hands after that meeting, that was my agreement. I'm a man of my word type thing.
Yeah.
So some people are quite chilled. We have had to have formal heads of terms written before. I can think of one case where there were 3 sellers, and one was quite relaxed about going with the email chain. The other 2 wanted something a bit more formal to hang the hat on. So, our standard MO is to follow that email process through, and that acts as heads of terms. But equally, if the seller needs something a bit more concrete, we're happy to do that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks for that. Okay. So heads of terms are in place now. And it's all on eyes on, completion date in 3 to 6 months' time, for example. So we've got legal due diligence, and then we've got the financial deed as well to work through. Yeah. So have you got your preferred providers for that you use now because you've made so many acquisitions?
Yeah, so we have a law firm who we've used for every deal we've done, essentially. Well, more so the woman, our main lawyer, she was at a couple of firms previously, and we sort of followed her to the point where she established her own practice 4 or 5 years ago, and we've used her ever since. That works better as far as we're concerned because she knows how we work. Lots of questions when you buy a practice. She doesn't need to ask us anymore. She knows what our stance is. She knows what our standard position is. So they handle all that. And we do our own FDD. We've got like a standard batch of questions that we get out. We've got different people within the business, our in-house accounts team and in-house HR and facilities and operations and all that kind of stuff. And as the data comes back from the seller, obviously that information goes to the various people within the business who will check it over and ask any further questions.
Yeah. And it's this stage where the being prepared with information prior is the most important, because we've done the high level headline and pieces earlier on in the process. This is really the deep dive into the business now, both from, as I said, the commercial aspect, the legal aspect, and the financial aspect. And I've even seen some vendors where they've decided that actually I don't want to go along the legal route at this point because they're fee sensitive, etc., and start trying to upload bits and pieces to the data room themselves, which is a huge distraction away from their business day to day anyway. But I always find at this stage it is good to have the lawyers there just to make sure that your data room is narrated correctly, presented correctly, because all in all, it's just going to save so much time and heartache and stress and strain for both sides involved, yourself, your lawyers, and the vendor and their lawyers.
Yeah, I think lack of information is a key one because we need that information. If you've not got it available, we touched on it earlier, if you've not got it available, you're going to have to go and pull it together. Where are all your employment contracts? Have you got a CPSE document for the properties? What's your health and safety policies? Like all these different things, systems, controls, procedures, processes, everything needs documenting and proving. Where is that document? It's all right saying, yes, we do that, right? Prove it. On the financials, can you give us a breakdown of all the every sale raised for the last 12 months? We only do that every couple of months, or, we're just journaling a sales figure and whatever it might be. Well, okay, that's all well and good, but we need it. So you're going to have to go away and get it. And I think what you'll find as well, most sellers have active day jobs within the business. I think we've bought off between 15 and 20 sellers now. Obviously 10 practices, but there's multiple partners within practices. And there's only been one chap out of all those people that could walk away on day one. So he didn't have an active role in the business. Most people, not only are they dealing with compliance and running the business, they're actually doing accounts, or they're reviewing accounts, or they're involved in audits and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And to have to come away from that and, from already doing 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week, whatever it might be, to then have to start pulling data together from in the DD process, it can be pretty onerous on the sellers.
Oh, absolutely. And could have a detrimental effect to the completion of the deal as well, because, if the business performance or the practice performance goes downhill during that process, then there might be a conversation to come back to the table.
Exactly. So it's definitely a thing. I mean, I think people used to talk about like a 2-year plan coming up to the point where you want to sell. You've got 2 years to get your house in order type thing. And I think that's decent advice. Chipping away at something over a period of time, an hour a week, 2 hours a week, if you know something's coming on the horizon, start pulling that information together, start new processes to start collating data. And then when the time comes, a year, 2 years, 18 months in the future or beyond that, you're already doing that information. You're already pulling it together. It's there at a push of a button.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you had any horror stories where, all seemed quite well, and then you've gone in deep into DD and there's been a few things that, red flags that have popped up that were probably insurmountable and you've had to walk away from a deal, or have you always managed to get through it somehow?
Yeah, we've not had anything when we've gone into DD and pulled out. We've had deals fall down at the negotiation stage, whether it's price or payment term or deal structure. But I think once we get beyond that and we've built up that sort of rapport with the sellers, there won't really be anything that we can't work through.
Yeah.
I think in any other industry, you could argue it's different. But I think because we're all accountants and we understand numbers and the concept of it, if performance has dropped, it's an adult conversation, isn't it? We were paying a multiple of this. That's no longer the case. We're not taking his offer on the table, but it might have to look a bit different. And, we're not talking about small 5% changes here and there. If there was something substantial, there's a conversation to have, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, I hate the phrase, but natural wastage within client banks is always there. People pass away, unfortunately, They sell their business, whatever it is. So that 5% buffer, I think people do get worried about that. And you're like, no, look, the acquirer is a practice owner as well. They understand the nature of the client base and will want to work with you.
Of course. That's right, yeah. And equally, there will be some wastage coming out the back end. But if you've looked at their accounts for the last few years and the turnover's not really budged within a few percent of itself, yes, there is natural wastage, but clearly they must be getting some new business in as well to maintain the level that it's at. So we don't get overly worried about small downturns in trade, but equally, we wouldn't expect them to be coming back to the table if there'd been a slight spike as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then whilst the DD is ongoing, obviously concurrently alongside that is, the SPA or the APA, whatever, whether it's a share purchase or an asset purchase. So these contracts are really that, I guess, the full fat of the heads of terms, so to speak, going into a lot of details. If there is still going to be some shareholding, there'll be a rewriting of the shareholders' agreements as well. So, without going into loads and loads of details around those contracts, what are the key specific points that you as an acquirer look to bottom out from an SPA or an APA point of view?
Yeah, I think once we get to this point, what's important for us is understanding the key members of staff within that business. So obviously, once your sellers have sold, so to speak, what's the next tier of management like? What do we need to do with these guys to keep them motivated? They've had the same boss for 20 odd years. All of a sudden, life's going to be a bit different for them. What do we need to do to keep those guys happy? So we'd be keen at this point with speaking with the seller to get an introduction to these individuals and try and start to build a relationship with them as well. Obviously, sellers are a bit cautious with doing that because at this point, the deal hasn't happened. It could fall through, and all of a sudden, the cat's out the bag with these managers or senior managers, whatever it is. But the important thing for us with them, there's two parts to it, really. Firstly, I ask them if they wanted to buy the business. So I want to make sure there's no sort of festering resentment or disgruntlement. Would they have paid the same as we would have done, for example, but didn't get the opportunity? So I think it's important to get that one out of the way quite early. But secondly, it's about sort of explaining to them that their opportunities for the career are now greater. They're part of a bigger group with, the chance for promotions within, the chance to run an area or head of a department or whatever it might be. So building that next level of relationship up is very important. Whilst we're going along with that, another key area that I jotted down was if the seller owns the building, what you tend to find is there's quite an informal agreement between landlord and tenant because they're very often the same person. But what you find with that is that the standard that the property needs to be up to prior to getting a formal lease in place with a new company is probably far higher than they thought it was. So getting them cracking with the CPSE documents along the way can be a problem. And we've had deals where they just couldn't get the property up to scratch in time for completion. So obviously we've had to put some sort of caveats within the SPA that gives an amount of time to get the property up to a standard post-transaction. But we've literally had a guy had to put a new roof on, had to put secondary glazing on a building, had to get, and listen, these buildings aren't falling to pieces by any stretch, but you'll probably be aware the standard that a building has to be in now to meet all the criteria from a fire safety or whatever it might be once the EICR gets done or all these different things, the EPC grading has to be at a certain level. And there's all these kind of things that people won't even think about because they just think, oh, the building's fine. So that is a key area, I would say, to mention on this. And I got it down in one of the points to sort of raise. That is a very important one.
Yeah. No, I must admit, property, whenever it's involved, can be a real fly in the ointment if you're not ahead of it. Even from a lease point of view, or if you're acquiring it, whatever it may well be, there's certainly a few points that people just tend to put off. But actually, if you get ahead of it, it's going to make a lot of difference there. And then the other point you alluded to there, which I found really interesting, was around meeting the staff. Whether that's senior leadership or some of the other just general team members. That it really is one of those most sensitive areas for any vendor or seller, as you kind of mentioned as well. People have different stages at which they like to go in and meet the team. Ultimately, it comes down to how comfortable, I guess, the vendor will be at any given point. And, at that point where you're going through DD and contracts are being drafted, I'd probably say that's the safest point to start meeting some of the senior leadership team for sure. Because, as you said, you'll need to see them for various reasons. But the rest of the team themselves, I always, and you may disagree here, but I always say once the deal's done, then tell the wider team. But those key individuals are probably the ones that you need to be in front of previously because they need to buy into the vision going forward.
Yeah. In my notes here, I've put, quite honestly, I don't know the answer to this question in terms of when's the best time to tell staff.
Yeah.
We've seen lots of different approaches on this, but what I will say, if it's perceived from staff that they've not been kept in the loop and they feel like they've sort of had a fast one pulled on them, we tend to get the blame as the buyer, as though it's something, why have you kept it from us? And I try and be on site on day one of any deal that we've done. And I try and just have like an informal chat with people. I don't like these big group Q&A sessions because you can get sort of bombarded a little bit. But I got chucked into one of those meetings at a recent deal that we'd done. All the staff that worked part-time had come in on this morning and they'd been told there's going to be some news. So I got put in front of them and literally the first question was, why has nobody told us about this? So that makes it very difficult for me because clearly I don't want to throw the old sellers under the bus, but equally I have no say in when they chose to inform their staff.
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult one. And in that particular case, there was a couple of senior management people that did know and that we had spoke to along the way. And I think some of the staff felt bad for them then. They were like, well, surely these guys know. And I'm like, yes, they did know. And then they feel a bit more of it, why do they know, not us, type thing. So it's very difficult around that one.
Yeah, no, it is difficult. So not to unsettle your staff. I mean, I've it's only once or twice in my whole career that I've seen that and all the transactions been involved, but we did actually have one where the acquirer pulled out 48 hours before the deal was due to be complete. And it wasn't anything to do with DD. It was all fine. It was just they had a different leadership go in, which had a different strategic outlook. And that new strategic outlook didn't include the acquisition they were looking to make. And it was only a few days beforehand that the acquirer had asked the seller to go out and tell the team of what was going on. And obviously, a couple of days later, had to advise them that it wasn't happening. And luckily, he had a good relationship with his team. I think there was about 30 of them. And the business stabilized. He didn't lose anyone from that. But that's a prime example as to why some vendors may be a little bit sensitive. Obviously, stressing there that is not the norm. And that's very rare to have that at that point.
A lot of sellers ask us for our opinion. When do you think we should tell staff? My common response is, your staff better than we do. You know your team better than anybody else. You can gauge what their attitude to it will be. And listen, if these guys have been having chats with them for years, building up to it, saying we're going to be considering our options in the future, or we might go to market, or that kind of thing. It depends how open they've been with them, sort of historically. And also, there's some obvious ones. If the guy's 75 or the woman's
exactly,
77. I don't think there's too many surprises from staff that clearly they had to do something at some point.
Yeah.
It's more if there was literally no idea that they were even considering it, it might be a younger ownership structure. It might have come completely out the blue. And if it's not delivered to staff in the right way, as I mentioned, it can sometimes backfire on us as the buyer there. And you're starting off on a bit of a negative foot.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why it's quite, as you said, you'd like to be there day one. I think that's really important, that post-completion point of view, which nice segue in, actually. So we've done the legal DD now. The FDD's been done. Everyone's comfortable. Contracts have all been agreed. And that, the lawyers do what the lawyers do and complete the deal and tidy up all of the filings, etc. They need to. So that's kind of the process from start to finish. Typically, how long do you tend to see that from that first initial meeting through to completion?
I can't really think of a deal where we've set a hard completion date. Very often, obviously, you'll know in accountancy there's peaks and troughs in terms of workloads and stress levels and that throughout the year. So we've just kept good comms open on it with the seller. And if we agreed a deal today, for example, then we're probably looking at it and saying, in reality, are we going to have it done before Christmas? It's going to be a push. Therefore, we don't want to complete in January. Let's aim for the 1st of Feb. Or let's aim for and we just have open dialogue on it. When's going to be a good time for us to complete at some point in the next, 4 to 9 months, any point within there. We've had a deal that we completed a year after agreeing the date because they wanted to get some stuff sorted, ready for completion at the next year end. So we're not in any rush to push things through. Very often the seller doesn't seem to be. Obviously there's third party things such as the budget coming in now, which sometimes things might trigger the need for a faster completion. But generally speaking, in all our cases, we've been quite relaxed as the buyer and the seller's been quite relaxed too. So just it happens when it happens. Things take time. Buyer going on holiday, seller going on holiday, work.
Lawyers going on holiday.
Lawyers going on holiday. It just takes time. It takes a long time.
Yeah. And sometimes these arbitrary completion dates put in place and they're good to focus the mind, I think, in terms of getting things done, but then don't start feeling really stressed with, 2 weeks to go or 10 days to go that there's certain tick off. Especially if there's a good relationship and there's open dialogue there, then don't work up about it. It's a stressful enough and emotional enough time for sellers in any regard, let alone having to hit these deadlines that may have been set that probably were impossible in the first place and not pragmatic in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the deal that we've got going on at the moment that we agreed quite a while ago, we set a deadline of the 31st of August. As we moved into August, it was clear on both sides that weren't going to happen. The seller sort of reached out and said, is it going to be a deal breaker now if we don't complete on the 31st of August? We're like, no, it's fine. We're fine if it's the end of September. It's fine. And then it's nice to work towards it. Like you said, it's nice to focus the mind and tell the solicitors it's got to happen by this date to keep them moving. But the reality is if it delays a month or even 2 months, whatever, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the process, just in a summarizing way, when you're looking at an opportunity, what are the 3 key things that you are looking for from a seller? And it doesn't have to be in that initial meeting. It could just be during the course of the process. But from the seller, what are the 3 key points that you'll be looking for as an acquirer?
I think good communication from the start is a crucial one. I think if you're firing emails off to the seller and they're not replying for 2 weeks, it gives you an idea of perhaps the chaotic business they're running. If they're not able to get a response off in a reasonable timescale, it kind of sets the stall out for what you might be coming up against in the future. The second one for me is don't change something that we've agreed. I mentioned about the sort of bloke down the pub kind of idea. If we've agreed on something, don't 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, once we've moved things on a bit, come back and say, actually, I know we agreed that previously, but I've had to think about it and I want to change it now. Again, they're kind of red flags that the kind of people that we might be sort of getting into business with might become quite difficult. And the third one is actually, you could argue it's the most important, but it's one of those that whatever promises people make, you don't actually know what you're getting until you've done the deal. And it's a willingness to allow us to implement the things that we know work and have got a proven record of working. We always say we won't change things for change's sake. We don't change things willy-nilly. We don't do it just because that's how we work. But if we've got a proven process that's worked time and time again, that will improve productivity, will reduce the hours of overtime that people have to do, it will improve output, all these different things, these metrics that we've tracked, and then they won't let us change them just because they're stubborn or they can't get used to somebody else making decisions. That is the biggest problem.
Yeah.
And I know what to look out for more now when we're having these talks, but ultimately it's the person being able to let go.
I like that last one there, and I think it's important as well, especially when you're considering practice, because there's going to be loads of practices out there where, especially if they're at retirement sort of age, they maybe have not moved with the times, so the technology is slightly behind, the processes aren't quite where they should be, and maybe even down to some of their employee benefits or packages are not quite up to date, but there's still a good core business there of good accountancy. They've got a good brand. They've got good service lines, good clients. So when you're looking at that, you can see the potential, but you need to make sure that those at the senior leadership that are going to stay around, or the person passing on, they realize that, yes, they haven't moved the times and it's going to be your job to do that. But as long as they can see that and they're happy to go on that journey with you, can see it's for the best, then that's, I guess, all you'll be looking for at that point.
That's right, yeah. And, we've had a lot of businesses who we've been, the first practice we bought in 2018, we're 6 years into that now. And whilst it's in the same office, it's got the same name, there's the same staff there, obviously there's been some churn, but the core business is still there. But it looks very different now because we've spent time doing the things on the business that the previous owner couldn't do because she was too busy in the business. We can focus on the business. And I think when we speak to people now, we can show them the journeys that these other practices have been on and where we've taken them from and to. And just because they're at the start of the journey, they're a bit more apprehensive, but we can show them, what it looks like at the end, if they allow us to do these kind of things. And when I say make changes, I'm not contradicting what I said previously about 90% stays the same and 10% changes over time. The subtle changes, sometimes it's just a different way of tracking something or a different way of reporting or a different way of logging or whatever it might be. The subtle changes that we've learned over time improve things. So it's just given us the ability to get in there and make those changes without resistance.
Yeah, to enhance what they've already got. It's not a changing for changing's sake. So
Correct. Correct.
And probably what we've just discussed there blurs into my next question that I wanted to talk to you about, which is, and without swearing or anything, because I'm sure there's been some stressful times, the challenges and pitfalls that you've come up against in processes. I know that I don't think some people really appreciate some of the most random issues that do occur sometimes during DD or just in the middle of a process, that when you're talking to someone about it, they just can't believe that's what's thrown it off. But it'd be good from your experiences. As you said, you've done 10 or so now. What are the 3 biggest challenges or pitfalls that you've come against that you've either had to overcome or walk away from?
Well, I mean, we've got one particularly unique one that obviously in very difficult circumstances. We got a phone call on a Thursday evening from a chap saying, my friend is basically dying. He's got an accountancy practice. He needs somebody to take it over. He's mentioned you guys by name. Is there any way you could, help out and take him on? And we said, give us a weekend, let's have a think. And he passed away that weekend. So we went in the Monday morning to try and help him out. And all his staff were on 1 week's notice and they all handed in the notice. So we were left trying to help out this guy and his wife, his widow. We got a business that we knew nothing about, and we weren't able to speak to the owner because he'd passed away, and we couldn't get any information from any staff because all those left as well. So that was probably the most challenging one we've had, albeit, that probably won't ever happen again for anybody else. So it's not exactly something to look out for. But
very strange story. I mean, I've had a couple of instances where I guess it's the very nature of people retiring. They're of a certain age where they're looking to sell their business. And we've had some unfortunately pass away during process, not quite at that very, very early stage that you just described there. But it is sad when it happens, and then you need to find ways of working around that. And that may well be with the deceased other half of other kind as well. I'm working through. We've certainly had that. Or there's some daughter
general challenges and pitfalls, and the 3 things I've jotted down here have probably been mentioned throughout the discussion. But ultimately, sellers who won't let go. That's a very crucial one. And I think people, before they come into this process, need to have a frank conversation with themselves and establish whether they are actually ready to sell up. It's not quite black and white. It's not a case of you are or you aren't. I think you need to get comfortable and play it out in your mind of what life might look like going forward when all of a sudden, you're logging your holiday days, or you're running it past somebody before you spend some money. These things that you've just done, it was second nature to you before. Now things have a different kind of feel to them. Are you actually prepared for that? And I think if you can honestly not reach a conclusion of yes in your head, you probably aren't ready to start this process, because it's not going to be much fun post deal if you weren't actually ready to let go, but now you can't make the same decisions that you used to. Lack of information, again, we touched on that. I think you can end up as a buyer having to sort of take a view on something. If they just literally can't get it, you're stuck in a bit of a position of, right, okay, well, are we comfortable generally here that we can take a view on the fact that that information is not available? And, I don't think it's ever come back to bite us properly, but sometimes, post deal, when you're in the business and running the new business, something will come up and you'll think, it'd have been useful to know that pre, I wish we'd have drilled down a little bit more into that. And then the third thing is uniformity. So clearly, if a business joins our group, we don't want to be in a position where some staff get better things than others, or, a client can ring one office and get something for cheaper than another. For us, it's bringing in things, it's pulling things into line that makes it difficult for us. Now, again, obviously, the way our model is, we've chosen that model, and it's something, I guess it's a small downside of our business model, but you'll find a lot of traditional accountancy practices are quite generous with perks. They might have written these contracts 20 years ago, and it's not about us. We're not against staff perks, but I think if anybody with any common sense looked at some of these contracts, that they're overly generous, ridiculously generous. So how do we deal with that? It's not a case of being able to say to all the other staff, right, you now move on to this contract. It's just not possible. So you do have sort of gaps within the uniformity section where, unfortunately, some people are on slightly different packages or policies to others, and trying to level that and manage the sort of comeback from that is quite difficult.
So that's your three major challenges and pitfalls that you come across in the process. And in conclusion there, then I think the main considerations, which has been a running theme throughout, certainly we mentioned earlier on, just making sure you're fully prepared with the information that you're gonna need at some point as well, which is going to make this a whole lot easier. Realizing the time consumption that it will take is going to be a drain on your time entering into these conversations, especially if you aren't prepared. It's going to be even more taking up a lot of your time capacity. So be prepared for that distraction within your business. Even part of preparation should be starting to move some of your client relationships, or most of your client relationships, to your staff anyway, alleviating yourself of certain day-to-day tasks, so you're just running the business. So hopefully by that preparation, it will help out that time-consuming point of view. And then I think thirdly is what you said right at the very, very start here, which was, can you be very clear that this is the right route for you, both financially and non-financially? But that non-financially piece, you're going to be living your new life, a new chapter day to day. So as you said, you need to be accepting of the fact that you might have to actually apply for your holiday. You might have to check with someone else before making that decision. So would you say they're the three main things that people really should be thinking about, both from an acquiring point of view and a selling point of view?
Yeah, I'd just add one final bit to that, and it's a question that I would pose to a seller. Would you buy it? If you were a buyer, would you buy this business off yourself? And I think that leads on to some brokers will still sort of push the narrative that you can achieve 1 times turnover or 1.2 times turnover for your practice. And you look at the practice, they're not making any profit.
Yeah.
Once you've adjusted it for partner salaries or whatever, there's no profit there. So you look at it and you can say, look, commercially here, we've got to make a return on our investment. Would you buy this business for a 5% return investment on your investment, or a 10%? It's just not going to happen. So I think posing that question to the seller, knowing what you know about this business, the profit you make, the hours that you work, all this kind of stuff, would you buy it for the kind of price that you're asking for it? And I think if you can put your hand on your heart and say yes to that, then it's probably a deal for us.
Yeah. Love that final point. And I have this a lot when we're negotiating deals for, both the acquirer and the vendor and the sellers. Exactly that point where, you need to put yourself in the shoes of the other party and what they're looking at. Yes, you may have been told that market rate is 1 times, 1.1 times, but as you said, for X, Y, and Z reasons, they might want a really high salary, which means profitability is not going to be there. The profitability might not be there, or there's going to be costs that need to be put in place to bring the practice up to where it needs to be, and understand that then will really help conversations, I think, from the start. But again, that goes right back to the start, from that initial conversation of identifying these key points. And if you can eliminate as many as you can at that point, then the risk mitigation is at its highest point that it's going to fall over or not fall over this deal. And actually make sure that rapport that you do build for every stage through to completion, you've got a happy life working together in the next chapter. If you deal things in the right way and communicate, as you said as well.
Yeah, I think as long as those initial meetings that you do get down the crucial points, and you do your concerns, and you do talk about what we're willing to go to and our sort of parameters of what we're willing to spend, you don't really need to waste any more than 2 hours before you can put a deal to bed if it's not for you. You don't need to be wasting any more time than, an hour or a couple of hours worth of discussion before you can say, you know what, this isn't for us. Or the seller can say, you know what, this isn't for us. I don't think you need to waste anything beyond that, as long as you're quite open from the start and have that open and frank discussion.
Yeah. Lovely. Well, Jonathan, really, really appreciate your time. Thanks for your insights and sharing your experiences as well on each and every stage. And hopefully, this will be really useful for people that are just either looking at acquiring or maybe looking to sell in the future or coming up as well. So appreciate your time. Thank you very much. And wish you and the rest of the SMH team all the best going forward.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I'll speak to you soon.